Oop. Share my screen. Cool. Oop. Cool. Awesome. So we are going to be doing the partials with locals lab. How did everyone do this, or is this your first exposure, or?
I've had a pretty busy week, so I haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah. It's, to be fair, it is on the my class schedule for Wednesday. So, but I kind of wanted to talk through it first, or like I kind of wanted to talk through it because I think people were banging their head against it, and I didn't want them to continue to do so. But if you haven't done it yet, we can talk about it. Um, Basically, we've reviewed partials a bit. Like I've been throwing them in since Intro to Rails, like our first mod. So this kind of tests, or this is kind of just showing you how we can more efficiently optimize it. And like the big thing about the partials with locals lab is that it wants to show you a tool, locals, which allows them to be a little bit more resilient to change and to like being thrown into different different controller actions and different views rather. So who here is familiar with the idea of a local?
I mean, just from the labs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Basically, the principle of a local is pretty simple. Like at a certain point, like you're going to be writing. I'm screen sharing, right? You might be writing a form for at students or something. And like this is, I'm spoiling the case here, right? And that's really helpful when you have an instance variable called like at students and you're working within your students controller. But then there will eventually maybe be a time when you're like, hey, this partial is really useful. I want to use it in my classroom views, right? And at that point, you're not calling at students, right? You're calling something called like classroom.students, right? And in that case, partials will allow us to, if we do a couple of changes, pass a different variable in um, without like having to repeat our whole app, right? And I'm going to show you a lot of what that means. But the big two takeaways are with partials, we suddenly don't really use instance variables when we use locals, we suddenly don't have to use instance variables inside of our partials. Instead, we pass them in. And that will allow us to like kind of use them in more ways than just normal ways. And then there's a bunch of like weird stuff that's just in this lab to mess with you. And we'll go through that too. Cool. So I'm going to get started. We currently have, this builds on a previous lab. I'm going to run Rails S real quick. I forgot to bundle install or whatever. Let's do that too. Install Rails DB migrate. Rails DB seed. Cool. And now I can go over to local host 3000/students. Think. And it's being like, hey, there's no template. I can do classrooms. /1. And basically nothing's here. You do this. Nope. So we're building a lot from a little here, but there is stuff in our views, right? We do have this like form for a student. We have a little file right here that like kind of builds a list with a student in it. And we can start looking at the requirements. So we're looking at the student. I bet there's a student /new. Let's take a look here. So we currently have this form right here, and that's helpful. And the first step is just, well, let's run learn, and so that we can like start going through the test we're gonna have to pass. Cool. So we get a bunch of failures. A few successes. And the big things that we're going to work on first, right, is that there's a student's create and a student's edit, right? Like the new and the edit both use this render form, right? That I'm trying to get to. And the first ask we have, and the one that I'm going to be solving first, is it asks for us to directly render the form in a student's form partial with the form object passed through as a local variable. So right now I'm just going to go to the Rails form partial local. Something will happen. Locals. So this is the documentation for how locals work, and it is a huge pal, right? Basically, it says like, hey, if instead of just saying render form, you say like render partial form, and then pass in this like optional like attribute that's locals is the key, and the value is a hash. You can start assigning like variables that then that form can use. So what this is saying is like, hey, we had this thing called @zone, and when we like got to this new.html.erb, I just want you to assign that to this key of zone, and then when in your local, zone will be a variable that you can call that in this case will refer to this. But if I wanted to like use this in a different place, if like I were suddenly in a a place or in like a different model that was like states.zones, right? Then like iterating through those, I would have to like maybe say something different here. I might not have an @zone. And this will still be functional by just changing what goes in here. So by putting zone equal to zone here, suddenly the way I call zone in the form isn't with an @, it's just with the variable. So I'm going to copy this basically directly, and I'm going to show you what that looks like in practice. So currently this render form works. We can take a look. This works. But if I do something like this, if I'm like, hey, this is actually a form for something called a student, it's going to break. Right? The way, but like this is what it means when it says, hey, refactor the partial so it takes in a form object is passed through with a local variable. The way we then use that here is we use something like this. Okay. So I'm just saying render form. Remember we have we do have an @student here, right? That's the thing that we're passing into new. So I'm going to just paste this. I'm going to say this student is now @student. And now this part should work, right? What will be the code for this year? And you notice that it suddenly works. Does everyone kind of get this concept right now? Of like what the local's doing?
So is this like a blanket statement that you're making? Like if we set it up like this for all locals and partials, it should work. Like this is the basic.
Yeah, if you're using an instance variable in a partial, the way that you make it more usable is to instead pass the instance variable as a local, which is just a local variable, and then make that form take in the name of that variable. And that's just generally considered a little bit better practice. You're not going to be condemned for not doing that, but this is going to make your forms a little bit more flexible. And I'm going to show you why that becomes important in a bit. So first, I want to make sure that this like create form directly, and I'll like do the same thing for edit. I'm going to just loop. Does everyone do people see what I'm doing here? What's changed in this student versus our previous one? How are we feeling about the basic idea of a local? It's saying, hey, we're actually making up a local variable and we're using this at student. And then instead of using this at student here, instead of using an instance variable, we're instead just creating a local variable called student. That's why it's called a local, right? We're being like, hey, this isn't an instance variable, it's a local that we're just creating. I'm going to pass this in when I render this form.
And at student would still be created in the controller?
Yeah. The controller is right here. And yeah, in this case, at student comes from the controller. I'm going to show you a case later where suddenly at student is going to be developed, like instead of getting an at student, we'll be using something different here. And that'll show the power of partials a little bit. But this is the basic concept, and we can refresh the page, and this still works. And if I run learn, these two tests should now pass. I hope.
Hey, Nikki, I understand how this works. That I get. But what I don't understand is why we're actually creating this partial, this with these locals to do this. I mean, this feels like extra work to do something that was. This replaces an instance variable in a line of code somewhere. But why would we choose to do this instead of just having that instance variable?
That's a really good question, and I'll show you reasons why we might do this as we go through this lecture. Right now, you're right. I just made a couple of lines of code slightly longer.
Perfect. All right.
Yeah.
I'll be patient. Thanks.
Yeah, and so when I say this is kind of best practice for partials, don't use an instance variable, instead of use a local. If you're finding hey, I'm just trying to do something really simple and I know I will never use this variable again, and I'm not working with someone else on a project who might use that partial again, an instance variable is fine. When you're working in a large code base, you do want to leave the door open for someone else to be able to use your partial, and I'm going to show why. But currently, I'm just going to pass this student's test, right? This show view, and then we'll keep going on. So let's go back to the show. And this should work. Do you have a student/1? Yeah. So this currently, I'm going to refactor this so that we're going to do the same exact thing where you're going to be like, hey, we're just making lines of code longer. Cool. I'm going to test this, and this test should now pass. And then we're going to get to why we do this. Great. So these basic things pass, right? I'm going to pull the README to the side just to make sure that I'm doing everything in accordance with their instructions. So we refactored form, we've refactored student. And now they're asking us to have a classroom show page, right? That shows all of our students using the student partial, right? So I'm going to go over to our classroom show page. And the first thing I'm going to do, I'm realizing right now that this UL is not going to be helpful to me. It's not going to be a friendly, or no, yeah, it will. It'll still be friendly. So now I'm just going to create this little H1 that I'm going to call students. And our next objective right here is to make it so that this students thing has a list of all the students that, I'm going to delete this. Or, well, Let's make it fancy, you know, while we're here. I'm gonna make it so that this is a list of all students, right? And my students partial does a lot for me. It's like, hey, I'm not only, I'm like doing a lot of birthday analytics or like birthday, like displaying methods. There's a lot here that I don't necessarily want to rewrite. Now, a classroom has many students, right? So we're currently in a place where I would want like a little, let's not make a UL. I would like, I now have a classroom like variable, right? I can prove to you that I have that. That's going to be, because this is just a regular show action. We have a classroom variable, and this is left over from the other lab. It's like they ask you to refactor it because it's like monstrous. But like we have this little like at classroom that's just the classroom that we found, right? And I'm going to want to like iterate through each of these to show each of the students on this classroom's page, and that's what it's asking me to do, right? So when you go to a classroom, you're like, okay, this classroom has these students in it. It's a helpful little thing that is very useful in real life. So I'm going to be like, hey, classroom.students, right? And that's how I'm going to call a classroom students, right? If I go over to my Rails C and I call classroom.first, like this would just be like we can name this like classroom, right? In this case, we have this classroom.students that we can now call, right? And it'll give us a list of all the students. We're all familiar with this. It's a has many belongs to relationship. We have all these methods. Dot each do student, right? Because we're iterating through a group of students here. And I'm going to not use the squiddy boys. We're going to use some ice cream cones here. And now suddenly there's an issue, right? There's two issues. First off, I'm in my classrooms view, right? So I can't call render student, right? Because student doesn't exist in this classrooms folder. Basically, if you're using a partial and you just use a string with that path, first it's going to look into like the one relating to the folder relating to that controller action that you're in. So currently we're in the classrooms controller. So it's only going to look in index and show by default. In students, I can write render student because student is a partial that I'm defining here, right? When I'm calling something from a different view, I just have to do the folder path. So I can say like, hey, look specifically into students and do like for the partial called student. And notice we still don't include that underscore. That underscore is for Rails to know that it's a partial. We still refer to it without that underscore. We all like convinced that like render student/student works. Cool. So, and I'm going to like, and now at this point, right? Unfortunately, student isn't like at student. We haven't defined at student at all. At student doesn't exist. And like creating it as an instance variable would be really messy and break everything because we're like trying to just use this random variable from the iteration. So like I could maybe do like at student equals student, but like that'll probably break and be weird. So like this refactor right here where I got rid of this at student from here means that suddenly I don't have to use an instance variable at all. I can just use the student that I'm creating here, right? Like the student variable that I'm arbitrarily naming here. I could also rename this Batman, right? But we'll talk about that in a second. I'm doing render partial student, locals, student. And now let's see what this does. I might need a comma here. And now I didn't need to write a single line of code to make this work, despite the fact that, or like a single extra line of code to make this work, despite the fact that we're in a different folder and we don't have an instance variable called student. We can now just use this. And this is why locals become important. They're a helpful tool for keeping our code dry, which is always useful in production. And the reason like we teach it as best practice is because you might be like, hey, I only need student over here. But like you as a developer in a group of like 30 developers who are all working together, someone else might be in charge of the classroom like page, and they might be like, oh, I really want to grab this code that the student, the person working on student is working on, and I really want to like, like add this little feature, and I want to keep consistency across my app. And then having that partial available when they see like, oh, cool, they didn't use an instance variable, that means that you just saved them a lot of work versus them having to like fix your code in order to get it to work for them. So that's why we teach locals. It's just a useful tool that makes it a little bit more, that kind of expands the flexibility of partials a little bit more. The goal of partials altogether is to make your code dry so that you like end up having consistent code across your app that you can change like just by editing one file rather than having to go through and edit in several files. Do you kind of get that?
Yeah, it's DRY all the time.
Yep. So now that we have this here, first we can test to see if I actually passed that test or if they are going to be finicky and demand more stuff from me. Let's take a look. Renders a partial that only contains classroom and not student information. Oh, they probably want a classroom partial. Let's take a look. Cool. So currently they're just being like, hey, you should probably abstract this to a partial too. So I'm just going to do that. And because we're now in the classroom's controller, I'm just going to call it classroom and put it in the classroom view. And I'm going to call this locals classroom at classroom.
So when you do that classroom colon at classroom, are you like technically setting a key value pair? Okay.
Yeah, very explicitly, we're doing here, let me. The explicit way to describe this is locals takes in an object of variable names as keys, the variable names that are going to be usable in your partial, and the values which all relate to what those will be set equal to. So this piece of code means that Rails now knows that at the beginning of classroom, like there's going to be a variable that's like classroom equals at classroom, but from the show ERB, right? Like, because this new at classroom doesn't exist in this partial, but classroom will. So yeah, it's just key, name of the variable we want to use, at like value, the value that we want it to be defined to. So here we now can test to see that this still works. Cool. We can test to see that I didn't break the test. Yep, we now have 5 failures, and you'll see that this is green. And what we just covered is basically the entirety of partials and locals. Like, between like all of this, you now know all the tools you really need to like make your partials and locals work. This next section of the lab is more about general Rails like review. It's about building a search term, like a search form that will allow us to search through all the list of students and then render out just the students we want. Cool? So I'm going to stop here for questions at this point.
I got a question. Is it safe to say that what we just did here with the locals, student, at students, or classroom, at classroom?
Mhm.
Same. Is it safe to say that we took an instance variable and turned it back into a local variable, and it's housed inside of a folder, if you will, called locals? Like, these are all the locals that I'm going to create, and we just took instance variables and turned them into local variables that are good for the moment you call it.
Yeah, we're saying, hey, these instance variables should become the local, like these local variables in the partial. So I can now also do something like Batman cheese, right? And now if I just say like, what do you think will render here?
Cheese.
That's correct.
Oh yeah.
Awesome. So
very cool.
Now, wouldn't you have to change your view for at classroom to be classroom instead to show the locals?
yes. Bloop, bloop. You're right. This still worked inside here, but it wouldn't have worked anywhere else.
Okay. I think my brain is a little broken. So back to the show. Yeah, there. Stop. So the student and at student is a key, right? So like a hash. It is a hash.
This is a hash.
Okay, so what's the locals colon part? Is that like a key as well? Like who is that?
Yeah, it is in this whole thing is a key value pair that represents an argument that the render can take in. So just to, I might have like this in the documentation.
So it's an argument for the render call then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this whole thing is in Ruby, it really looks like this. And it's going to be like, oh, there's a key value pair. Cool, I know what the locals key is for. It's specifically for something that render has access to, right? Like the render method can take in an argument called locals and then do something with a hash that it gives. Like it expects locals to have a hash, and that's what it does.
And same thing for partial and form.
Yeah.
Okay, and the parentheses just made it make sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So at this point, we're going to start working on the search. How are we feeling about locals, partials, and forms, and like how we can reuse things in views? I'm going into a lecture on it tomorrow, which is just going to review it from the ground up. This is like we're kind of doing AP views before we do or AP partials before we do like regular partials, but like this is just a really useful tool. So now I do want to get to the search function because it's just a cool thing, and we'll learn a lot about Rails as we do it. So basically, I'm going to like look at this README. And like make sure that I have the search functionality right. So first off, I actually kind of might make a pull request to this lab because I think that it's a little bit less explicit about where you're supposed to put the search functionality. Basically, on the students index page, right, we want to have a form that has a search bar, right? And in that search bar, I would be able to I want to have it so that then if I like post, or if I like do a post from that search bar, or rather not a post, if I do a request from that search bar, like I would want to go to something like, very explicitly, it wants me to be able to do something like this. Kyle just went off camera as I did this, so it's always Ruth. So HTTP : //
I feel very fitting.
local host 3000 /student /query /root equals Ruth. What I want to happen here is for it to render the same student's index page, but only show the names of students who match Ruth. But in the alternative case, where this doesn't exist, I want to be able to just render all students. So I'm going to do this in two parts. First, I'm going to make it so that this behavior works, and then I'm going to create that actual search bar to make it so that we can enter it rather than like having to type it into our machine. Cool? So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to close a bunch of this garbage. And then the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the student's controller. I'm going to put in a bybug into index. And now over here, so we have in IRA, I think we have to do this. It is not letting me use bybug. Those cruel monsters. I'm going to now get angry at them. Can I do this?
Do you need another slash? Just wondering, after the question mark?
Yeah, I think this will still...
It gives you a
that works.
URL in the README.
Yeah, that URL, though, is just to like show what a query parameter is supposed to look like, rather than to be the one that we want, the route that we want. And that's why I'm going to edit this slightly. But like this is basically what we're going to want to be able to do. And I'm just going to now, because they're bad, I want to be able to like open up this this bybug, but instead I'm just going to do a puts params at a key of query, right? And I'm just going to show you what happens when I do this. I'm going to get rid of the bybug. I'm going to go here again. Okay, first let's build like an empty hello world for @students. Great. Bloop. So now this works. And you also notice that I had this put statement. Let's make it very visible. And now I'm going to be like query equals error. So now I've gotten like, now you'll notice that it actually translates this into params, even though I don't have a route that says like query equals or whatever, right? Do you all see that? It immediately, when I said puts params query, it like said, hey, they actually also sent over some parameters with this request. And these parameters were specifically the string called IRA. Turns out that if you put like a question mark, then a series of key value pairs, like that are written with like equals, and then like something like this, it will start parsing them as parameters. These are things that are called URL params. When I first was introducing Rails, I had that big infographic of like, look, this is all of the things that can be in a URL. One of these things is a series of like params that are set aside with equal signs, and then strings. It's weird, but it's the thing that happens. Do you all see how like I got the word IRA to come up in my console? How are you feeling on that?
Not too sure.
Yeah. I wonder if this changed anything. Yeah. Basically, by saying, hey, I'm putting a question mark here, and then said query equals IRA. Then it just went to the /students route that we know from before, right? And it looked at, and it was like, oh, by the way, when they send us to /students, they also sent over query equals IRA. So I'm assuming that this is something that I'm going to put in the params as query set equal to IRA, right?
I
That's
see.
something
I
that
see.
Rails will do for us. And so when I put params query, it was like, yes, query equal to IRA. I'm going to show you how Rails uses this by default in a bit. But right now, I now want to make it so that there's a method here. So instead of using this this student.all, right? I'm going to instead make it so that this takes in that parameter. Like this will be nil in other cases, but like instead of using student.all, I can now do something that'll be like student.search params query. And now it's my job to make this functionality work. And according to the README, the functionality is as follows. If they search for nothing, give me, if there's no params query, give me every student. If there is a params query, then find only the students that match that query, right? So the next step is to define this method. Do y'all see where I'm going with this right now?
Yeah, we'd have to define a query method.
Mm-hmm. Or we'd have to define a search method, but yeah.
Or search, yeah.
Yep. And this is clearly a job for the model. So I'm going to go over here. Just going to say def end. Now remember that this is a method that we're calling on the student class. So how would I write a search method on the student class?
Self.search.
Yep. And I'll take in the params query as an argument that I'll call query. And now the README like tries to tell you about search, right? And you remember that I've done it a couple of different ways. I use include when I'm like being specific. The most efficient way to write like a search, I'm just going to copy this code. And I'm going to try to explain this. What this is saying is, hey, take a look at the name of the student and see if it's like basically if it compare it to this string with some weird expression in it. These parentheses represent wildcards. It means on either side, anything you want or nothing, right? Right here, though, it says M. M in this case is just like there should be an M somewhere in the student, right? So I'm going to instead write IRA. I'm going to show you what happened. We should at this point actually start rendering out some students. I'm going to just do that real quick. So we have the student partial that I'm going to be stealing. At students dot each do student end. What should go here?
Student dot name. Do we want to?
So I kind of want to use this partial that we have because that's like, let's find out about all the students, right? But yeah. I guess like that was an equally correct answer. But let's use this because that's right now we're flexing with partials. And what's this going to be here?
Student colon student.
Yep. Cool. So now you'll notice that by writing this method right here, I'm saying like, hey, the name is always going to be equal to Ira. We're getting, this works for Ira, right? This code like shows us Ira's name and like shows up for Ira. How can I now change this to be dependent on the query?
Pass in the query where you typed in Ira.
Yeah. Cool. So now you'll notice this totally, it's not doing anything right now because I didn't pass in a query at all. So it's being like name like wildcard. Here you go. Like it's being like this just renders out to this. So what you're saying when there's no query is like name like anything. What you're telling SQL is like, hey, grab the students with a name that's set equal to anything because these are just like, just do it. When I put in Ira, it suddenly becomes anything plus the string Ira. So when I go over here, instead I'm like, hey, anything equal to query, this suddenly becomes different. I'm going to refresh this page. Now I can be like, query Ira. Question mark. That's how we separate this from an ID. You'll notice, do you know why we got this error? I think that's actually worth mentioning.
Is it because it's looking for an ID called Ira and not a name?
We have this very helpful route called classroom/ID that we've used tons of times. And usually we pass in right there an ID, right? Like, so if I did student/1, it'll give me the first student. If I do student/Batman, it'll give me this error. There's no student with ID equal to Batman. That would be a very strange database. So the way that Rails denotes, hey, we're actually now sending over some string parameters from a URL. Does it after a question mark? Anything after a question mark, it goes, okay, we're no longer in the routes. Now we're in this query string. And I can say, hey, query equals Batman, and it'll be like, there's no students named Batman. And I'll be like, darn, maybe next time. Not that all of your names aren't lovely, but we've got Ira. You can try this, lowercase. And SQL uses the like to be case insensitive. Loop. Now we have Schultz, Chantal, anything with a CH in it. We can type these in. This is a cool feature that our users can't use. But do people see how this is working right now? Do people believe me on why all of this happened? Great. So at this point, there's one other thing that I think like you were probably all not necessarily taught that made this lab very cruel. But there's an easy way to create a form that does this for us. I'm going to show you it. we're back here. There's this thing that we talked about a lot called the form tag. And I'm just going to write, I'm not even going to pass it a URL right now. I'm just going to say method get. We'll have a do. We'll have an end right here. What will this show me so far?
A box that says query.
Yeah, box that says query. We don't have f dot. Fine.
Maybe.
That was that you are still correct. Box the word query, right? We can now do a submit tag. I'm going to show you what this gives us. And let's make it a search by student. I'm going to inspect this. And we can even get rid of this label. It's like right now, the search by student explains everything. So what I'm saying is, hey, this method is secretly get, which is unusual. I think I did that right. Nope, that is wrong. That's why it was confusing me. That's also, I'm not going to be able to edit Rails by doing. So a form has to be a post. But the reason, can a form be a get by in a real way? Like, can we send over form parameters as a get? I just realized I used a rhetorical question. We can't. Get is unlike post or patch or whatever, in that it doesn't send over something called query parameters. I might be able to even show you what's the alternative way, right? Let's do post first, and I'm going to just show you, and it's going to error out. We know it's going to error out. I'm going to keep open this network tab, right? And I'm going to do Ricky. And you'll see right here in the, I have this network request that went out and said, hey, this is a request to /students. The method was post. It was a bad request. But if you scroll down at all the headers, you also have this thing that's called form data that's right here, right? And it had this query called Ricky, right? You also have this query string parameters versus the form data, right? And that says method equals post. That's this guy. And that's how we communicate. That's how we send params over in a GET request. Because in a GET request on its own, we don't usually have access to form data. I really hope that Rails doesn't do something tricky and just send it over as a post and then pretend it's a GET for your sake. Because this will be something that's important in JavaScript. Whatever we send over as a GET request becomes a query string parameter rather than a form. So do method get. Just gonna hop back here. I'm just gonna do the search by student now. I'm doing something really weird here.
Don't you have to add it to your params that are coming in?
It's not supposed to be a param. I think that I'm supposed to write this in a different way. I think it's actually is supposed to be this. Method this. Okay. Let's try that one more time. Why are you saying method post? All right, well, Roosevelt, let's do Roos. We can, if you all don't want to watch me just read the documentation to see why this is breaking, I can take a 2-minute break, or you can just watch me do this. But it's sending, for some reason, it's doing this as a post request, where that's not supposed to happen with a form tag. I'm gonna say start back here at 7. Is that cool with everyone? If you just like want, I'm not gonna like solve this code while we're waiting.
So does it matter that in the errors it said that the param wasn't permitted?
Yeah, but that's not like, right? That's because it's sending it over as a post request, right? So it's going to our create action and it's being like, whoa, 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 we don't have this little thing called get. Okay. So I'm gonna just copy this. Oh, I'm an idiot. Hell yeah. Great.
Isn't it so the colon before method and then the equal greater than sign and then get is in quotations do?
Like this. I'll try that.
Yeah, and then the form tag needs someplace to go, like in a path, right? Right after form tag,
it might
there's a
be
path.
because I'm not being like very explicit with the path.
Student path, yeah.
Let's try that out and then we can debug from there. There we go. Cool. Right back in time for the slash students. Yeah, I wasn't passing in a path, so it wasn't reading this really. I think you can still write this. Oop. So you do need the student's path. That was my big error. Because it expects a path before it starts going into the other kinds of options. So here we are back. And we now have it saying the method is get, right? And remember how earlier we had this query string, we had like the query string parameters and then we had the form params. So we can do mark now. And this works. And if you take a look at this network request I just sent, let's do, we're going back to IRA. You see that now, despite the fact that this is a form, there's no form data at all because a GET request doesn't do form data. A GET request only does query string parameters. Everything in a GET request is a query string parameter. So you'll see even when I like hit the search, it like sent it back with all my parameters being like, hey, you might want this again. And like threw in some extra ones being like, hey, this looks like UTF-8. The commit, like the message right here was searched by student. And like, but like, basically, this query string parameters behaves differently from form data. It only accepts strings from the URL. And then it sets them up in this little like request for us. So you'll notice when I posted this, when I did my search, right? Like all my route says to do in this form is it says, hey, go to /students with this get request. But I gave this form data, and I'm going to say IRA, right? And you're going to see that's not actually going to /students. Instead, it's going to this big URL. That's the Rails form tag helper for us being like, oh, you're doing a get request. So I'm just going to shove all these parameters into the URL for me, right? And that's very different from how we do forms. When I do a post request, I'm going to hit an error right here. When I do a post request, IRA. When I do a post request and then refresh the page, I type IRA again. I get a fail, and you'll notice none of these parameters are here because a post request doesn't need it to be in the URL. A post parameter doesn't need to set up a bunch of key value pairs in the URL. Instead, it sends it over as form data. So does patch, so does put. I don't believe delete does. We can test that out right now. Delete might. Shrug. Can do delete request. Let's hop back. Loop. IRA. Let's do this. Loop. Delete also goes to just, right, because delete does like a little hidden method in this form data. Everything else is using post because like we do like these, like we do the form data with the secret methods. Our get request though the information needs to go to the URL and it sends it over with this. And then we can be like, oh, query equals IRA, cool. Rails knows how to handle that sort of param. It shoves IRA into params of the key of query. And then our little method right here takes that query, finds the student where the name is equal to query or like shares query, and then it sets this equal to @students, and then that gets re-rendered on the index page. So this right here solves our problem. I refresh the page. And now this works. Do people now kind of see what get requests are doing when you put them in forms? It's really different from what post requests are doing. Now I can run learn, and hopefully it doesn't ask me to be like, hey, rename things. Cool. Questions? What was the weirdest part of that?
That you didn't have an if statement in your student controller or in your student model.
Yeah, but this is because when we have this little thing right here, this says where the name is anything at all. Because these right here are wildcard. Just give me something. Right in between it. In between that something, give me this. So
if it doesn't exist, it'll give you everything.
It'll just be like, cool. You probably delete that. Trish still works. Incredibly, wow, Doctor born after 2001. That's Doogie Howser level. So how about any other questions? How are we all feeling? Do we understand the point of locals? Because we just went into search for a little bit and get requests. Cool. All right. Everyone enjoy your day. Cool.
Thank you.
Later.
Thank you.